Is it on now? Okay. Thank you very much, Annalie. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, you're right. Science Europe represents a large number of funding agencies, funding and performing agencies across Europe. We're around 50 organisations, and we certainly agree that the ERA is an ambitious and exciting new opportunity. What I'm going to talk about today are some of the perspectives from our National Research Organisation point of view, talk a little bit about some of the difficulties that there are, but also try and emphasise, and I think I agree with Keith here, I think much can be gained from working together in a voluntary way, and actually when you look at the examples of what's worked well in the past, basing them on trusted arrangements between organisations is often a very good way to go. I think we also have to be very clear about definition. What is it we really mean by the ERA? And the sooner we tie down what it is we're trying to achieve, in, I hope, in an imaginative way, rather than simply focusing entirely on specific mechanisms, then I think we may be able to move forward. We all know the value of collaboration. This chart simply demonstrates the impact through citations of papers that are co-authored. It's showing here. Could somebody get my presentation? There we are. Okay, the first slide you can ignore. That was just the title slide. So, this slide simply shows the value of collaboration, focusing particularly on the impact through citations that papers produce. You can see here we've taken papers from the UK and given national papers a weighting of 1, and you can see that the weighting for papers that involve collaboration with the US end up with a citation impact of around 1.6, with France about nearly 1.6 as well, Germany about 1.5, and India and China also lead to publications that have more citation impact. There's a variety of other reasons why we could talk about the value of collaboration. As scientists, we all agree that the aim is to bring together the best minds to solve the most difficult problems, and in fact we find that often when you do that, you end up with more powerful publications. The fundamental challenge of the ERA, of course, the ambition of it, is somehow to come up with a diverse and flexible ERA where national organisations can act effectively together in their collective interest. And that's the critical point. We need to make sure that whatever we produced is going to work well for all the various agencies and member states so that they're all willing to buy in. There are several axes that underpin this, axes of diversity that we have to take into account. Models of support between, for example, the funders and the performing agencies. Clearly they have different remits and will have different ambitions. The difference between excellence and cohesion, which of course can come together occasionally, but there's tensions there on occasion. And the relative emphasis on bottom-up versus directed research. The balance between researcher-led ideas and top-down thematic programmes. As Annalie pointed out, we hosted a recent workshop in Slovenia just a couple of weeks ago now, which brought together members of Science Europe, the various organisations, the Commission, and we were very pleased to see good attendance from the Commission, and also the national ministries. And we talked, as we are today, around the 5 core areas of ERA: research, mobility and careers, cross-border operation, infrastructure, knowledge exchange and open access, and internationalisation. And what I'm going to focus on here today are just 2 of those: research and mobility and cross-border operation of research actors. These are dimensions in particular that I think our agencies have to work together on to achieve, are to some extent already doing so, but perhaps could do better in the future. So if we think about cross-border operation of research actors, we need to take into account a variety of things. Let's be honest, we know that there are different research environments across Europe that we're trying to blend together. Those differences, of course, lead to diversity, which can be very valuable, but they also lead sometimes to challenges. We have a mix of, let's be frank, quite small and medium-sized countries in Europe, and that can lead to duplication of effort and fragmentation. We have a mix of richer and poorer countries, larger and smaller amounts that are able to be spent on research. And we have a mix of scientifically stronger and scientifically weaker countries, and we're somehow trying to bring those all together in the pursuit of excellence, try and bring everybody up to challenge other countries outside Europe, of course. Outside of the framework programme, common pot sort of approach, there are two main approaches that we might use to try and encourage this. Money crossing borders, and through that we mean things like money following researchers who wish to take their grants when they move between countries within Europe. Money follows cooperation, so engagements that involve people collaborating across different countries but funded by a single agency, and perhaps a common pot approach. And then we also have mechanisms where money does not cross borders, things like lead agency procedures, also things like a virtual common pot. And of course there's pros and cons for each of these. Money crossing borders can lead to some valuable insights, and money not crossing borders is also useful to agencies in other ways. So let's think about research mobility in particular, less on careers, not to say of course that isn't vitally important, but I'm focusing in on mobility. We need more measures to encourage and promote research and mobility, and it's essential that we embed those in the ERA. We agree that more could be done to promote mobility, and not just mobility across academic institutions, but also mobility that involves industrial partnerships as well. We also need to focus in on the portability of grants. So let's think about the money follows researcher approach, where money would cross borders. An agency has given money to a researcher, that person gets a job in another country and is able to take that grant with them. Well, 27 organisations have signed up to this principle in Europe, but it's true that the amount of money that's passing across borders is relatively limited. And so we need to do more work to increase awareness among the scientific community that this is possible, but we've also got to think about whether or not this sort of policy can be detrimental to some states compared to others, and I'll go on to that in a second. We also need to think about the cross-border operation of research actors. So the Commission should build on the strengths that we have already. We have made progress in this area, and we do think that there's some mechanisms that would be at the European level, things like we've heard about, the joint programming, the ERANET, but there's also bottom-up flexible approaches that are already in place and used by some agencies and member states. So, for example, money following cooperation, lead agency procedures. The first, money crosses borders, the second, money does not cross borders, and a virtual common pot, something which we call in the social sciences an open research area, where again, money does not cross borders. So let's think about some of the pros and cons of these. I know we're getting into a little bit of the detail, but it is, I think, important if we're going to think about achieving this, that we also think about the practicalities. What about when money crosses borders? Well, the evidence that we've gathered together as research agencies is that, first of all, the slightly weaker countries might be more likely to seek cooperation with the stronger ones. That's not a bad thing, but can lead to some challenges. Reciprocal arrangements is an issue. Sometimes we get arrangements going in one direction but not the other. The fraction of our budgets crossing borders is larger for the smaller countries than it is for the bigger countries. We also know that the brain drain that results from that is likely to be in one direction, from the weaker countries to the stronger countries. And we also know that the funding in these different countries varies. So in the weaker countries, the poorer countries, they perhaps give less for salaries, less in overheads, whereas these things might be higher in other countries. There can also be legal obstacles for certain countries about allowing money to cross borders. Some countries are very strict about not allowing money for research to cross borders, while others seem to be more flexible. The process of these sorts of mechanisms is actually fairly simple for applicants and for the funding organisations, but it tends to work best when you've got agencies or member states that are working at a fairly similar level. If there's not a similarity, then you tend to find the direction of travel is in one way. And as a result of that, it's no surprise that these mechanisms might be preferred by the larger or scientifically stronger countries. We heard in Slovenia from Austria, who actually I think is one of the most progressive nations in Europe. It has a money follows researcher approach, money follows cooperation, it's involved in lead agency approaches, and they've seen a situation where they've allowed money following researcher, and it's led to a very significant net outflow to Switzerland and Germany, and no inflow from Switzerland or Germany. If that's the situation, obviously as time goes on, Austria is going to start questioning whether they should continue with this if the flow of money is only in one direction. What about money not crossing borders? Well, reciprocal arrangements is not such an issue there. It's simple for the applicant, but actually many of these mechanisms are quite challenging for the research funding organisations, and they can lead to a range of different agreements between countries which are difficult to administer, particularly in times of austerity. It works in unsymmetric situations. This actually is in its favour. But critically, the precondition is trust. And I think trust is a key word here. Trust between the organisations that are trying to encourage this sort of mechanism. We have to, for example, trust each other's peer review standards, and we also, at least one of those partners, if it's a lead agency arrangement, has to trust the peer review standards of another agency. And we have different approaches here. We can distinguish, for example, between lead agency and things like the ERANETs. Well, let's take the examples I know best from my own council, the Economic and Social Research Council, social science funding agency in the UK. What do we do? Well, I think we're fairly flexible. We have agreed to money follows researcher, and we publicly state that. So anyone who leaves the UK and wishes to take a grant, we will enable it. We do have a money follows cooperation line. We call it an international co-investigator policy. Any academic in the UK who comes to me for a grant can include 30% of that grant for a collaborator abroad. We will fund that collaborator abroad, be it in Europe or anywhere else in the globe. So we do have that process, and indeed we'll increase that percentage up to 50% if there's a reciprocal arrangement, if both countries agree to do it in both directions. So we have that approach. And I think more importantly, we're involved in a virtual common pot with colleagues from France, Germany, the Netherlands and ourselves, what we call the open research area. The second round is just underway now. We've put around 15 million euros into that. We all fund our own researchers. It leads to a number of multilateral and bilateral projects on an annual basis. As I say, the second round is underway. We hope to include the United States. It's very likely, I think, the NSF will be included in round 3. And then in round 4, we want to extend to a range of other European countries. So basically, having built an arrangement on trust, with 4 organisations who work exceptionally well together, we now feel it's time to start thinking about growing that and including more countries in Europe. We're also in the business, this is a purely responsive mode, so it's not thematically driven. We're also now talking about replicating this with a thematically driven aura. So a set of mechanisms that we think do allow for cross-border movement. So to summarise, and I'm drifting here into a number of the things that we think would be positive about the ERA. First of all, we think it is crucial because of the larger market for the circulation of knowledge and research talent. For example, grant portability. We agree it's essential we move towards this. We need the capacity to speak with one voice, and Science Europe is hoping to be able to do that for research performing and funding agencies on really important topics like, for example, open access. We need to achieve critical mass, the capacity for multinational teams to address scientific and societal challenges, which may arise bottom up or thematically from the top down. And we have to subject scientists to similar standards of peer review, reduce duplication of effort, and think about Europe as a laboratory for trying out some of these policies which we might develop at a EU or indeed a national level. Finally, the ambition, of course, is that we want to improve our research outcomes. The ambition is not to set up mechanisms. The ambition is to improve our research outcomes, but to adopt whatever mechanisms are important to achieve that. If researchers are working together in a fluid way and don't find any obstacles, we don't have a problem. If there are obstacles, we have to solve them and think about the best mechanisms to use them. 2014 is a very ambitious target, but it's a particularly ambitious target if we're not clear about what it is we're trying to achieve by 2014. What precisely do we mean? How would we be able to state that the ERA had been, that we'd successfully achieved it if we're not very clear about exactly what we're trying to achieve? There are many collaborations in existence already. We can push forward with the variety of models, some of which I've discussed here, sharing good practices and monitoring the impact. And I'm committed to doing that, and I think Science Europe will be keen to work with agencies to achieve that. We think progress may be best achieved, at least in some areas, by allowing national agencies to pursue the approaches which fit their needs best. There are unlikely to be mechanisms which will suit every single member state and every single agency. But there are a number of mechanisms that might suit a lot of them, and there's a number of other mechanisms that very sensibly should include a few of those organisations. If in the end we get the balance right, European research will be able to act collectively on a scale that's competitive with the big nations, US, China and elsewhere, while remaining flexible, responsive and adaptive. Thank you very much.